The fluorescent lights hummed with a tired persistence, casting a pale, even glow across the stainless steel tables. The morgue smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold metal, a smell that had long ago stopped meaning anything to him. Night shifts were quieter, more honest in a way. Fewer interruptions, fewer conversations. Just work, procedure, and the steady rhythm of tasks learned so well they no longer required conscious thought. He checked the clipboard again, more out of habit than necessity. Female. Approximate age mid-20s. Found unresponsive. No identification. Cause of death listed as undetermined pending examination. Nothing unusual. There was almost never anything unusual. He pulled on fresh gloves and approached the table. The sheet was drawn neatly up to the woman's shoulders. When he folded it back, he paused, not because protocol demanded it, but because something in him hesitated. Her face was calm, not slack or distorted the way death often left it, but composed, as if she had simply drifted off somewhere far away. A loose strand of dark hair curved along her cheek. He felt a flicker of irritation at himself for noticing such things. Sentimentality was useless here, dangerous, even. He had learned early in his career that distance was a form of respect. Still, his eyes lingered. There were no visible signs of trauma. No marks that immediately told a story. She looked untouched by whatever had brought her here. He forced himself back into routine. Instruments laid out, notes reviewed, time recorded. The quiet of the room pressed in, broken only by the soft clink of metal and the muted hum of refrigeration units along the wall. He had performed this sequence hundreds of times, maybe thousands. Muscle memory took over, yet a faint unease crept in, the kind that had no clear source. He told himself it was fatigue. Too many late nights, too much coffee. The brain, like any other organ, could misfire under strain. He began. The first moment of resistance came not from his hands, but from his mind. Something about the expected order of things felt disrupted, like a familiar song played half a beat off. He stopped. He stared down, frowning slightly. His heart gave a sudden, sharp thud against his ribs. This wasn't right. He checked again, slower now. Signs he had expected to see simply weren't there. His training reeled forward automatically, pages of textbooks flipping in his memory. Rare conditions, unlikely scenarios, the kind professors mentioned only in passing, more as intellectual curiosities than real possibilities. No, he murmured, the word barely audible. He stepped back from the table, pulling off one glove, then the other, hands suddenly unsteady. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He reached for the chart again, scanning it with new urgency, as if the paper might have changed while he wasn't looking. Undetermined, undetermined. How many times had he trusted that word? He moved quickly now, checking monitors that had long been silent, bringing equipment closer, his movements sharp and clipped. His mind raced ahead, calculating, replaying the chain of events that must have led here. Someone had declared her dead. Someone had been sure enough to sign their name. A faint signal appeared, so subtle it could have been dismissed as interference if he hadn't been looking for it. His breath caught. He leaned closer, eyes fixed, afraid to blink. There it was again. His pulse roared in his ears. Training kicked in with brutal clarity. Protocols for the living were very different from those for the dead, and he had crossed that boundary without knowing. The weight of that realization settled on him like a physical force. "Stay with me," he said, instinctively, absurdly, as though she could hear him. He moved fast, faster than he thought himself capable of, undoing what he could, calling out into the empty corridor, his voice echoing back unanswered. He reached for the phone, nearly dropping it, and barked for assistance, words tumbling over each other in a rush that betrayed his usual calm. Minutes stretched, warped by adrenaline. He watched for any sign, any confirmation that he wasn't imagining this. Doubt clawed at him even as hope flared. Had he misread? Was this just a reflex, a meaningless artifact? The responsibility pressed down harder with every passing second. Footsteps finally sounded beyond the door. Voices. The room filled with motion and sound, professionals snapping into action, questions fired and answered in clipped phrases. He stepped aside, hands hovering uselessly at his sides, watching as others took over. As they worked, he felt a strange detachment settle in, as though part of him had retreated to some safe distance. From there, he could see himself clearly. A man who had trusted process over instinct, certainty over doubt. A man who had almost made an irreversible mistake. Time blurred. Orders were given. Equipment whirred to life. Someone brushed past him, not unkindly, but with purpose. He caught fragments of conversation, possibilities, risks, next steps, but they seemed to float just out of reach. At last, there was a pause. A collective stillness. One of the clinicians turned to him, face unreadable. "There's a chance," she said carefully. "A small one. We'll do what we can." He nodded, unable to speak. His throat felt tight, his mouth dry. He watched as they prepared to move her. The table suddenly transformed from a place of finality into one of fragile potential. When they wheeled her out, the room felt emptier than before. The hum of the lights returned to prominence, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The instruments lay exactly where he had left them, silent witnesses to the thin margin between routine and catastrophe. He sank onto a stool, elbows on his knees, and pressed his gloved hands together until they trembled. Images replayed relentlessly. The moment of hesitation, the split second where habit could have carried him forward without thought. How many others, he wondered, had been less lucky? How often had certainty gone unquestioned because it was easier that way? Eventually, he stood and began to clean up, motions slow and deliberate. There would be reports to file, explanations to give, investigations, perhaps, consequences he could not yet see. But beneath all of that, a quieter understanding took root. Death was not a single moment. It was a process, a threshold with blurred edges. And standing at that threshold required more than knowledge. It required humility. He turned off the lights and left the room, the echo of his footsteps following him down the corridor. Somewhere beyond the morgue doors, the night went on, unaware of how close it had come to swallowing a life whole, or of how close one man had come to letting it happen. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead, their cold brightness flattening everything beneath them into shades of pale white and steel. The morgue was never completely silent. It breathed in its own mechanical way, refrigerators whispering, ventilation sighing, electricity vibrating through the bones of the building. He had worked here long enough that those sounds blended into something almost comforting, a reminder that systems were functioning as they should. He adjusted his coat and glanced at the clock on the wall. Just past midnight, the hour when the rest of the hospital slowed, when urgency softened into routine. Night shifts suited him. Fewer conversations, fewer questions. The work demanded attention but not explanation, and he liked that. The dead, at least, did not argue. He picked up the clipboard and reviewed the file again. Female, estimated mid-20s, found unresponsive in a public place. No documents, no phone. Brought in by emergency services after resuscitation attempts were deemed unsuccessful. Time of death recorded by another physician. Cause pending examination. Undetermined always bothered him a little. It was an admission of uncertainty disguised as neutrality. Still, it wasn't his role to question what had already been decided. His job was to confirm, to observe, to document. To tell the story the body could no longer speak aloud. He set the clipboard aside and approached the table. The sheet covering the body was folded neatly, hospital corners precise. He hesitated before pulling it back, aware of the faint pause in his movement. That, too, annoyed him. Hesitation implied emotion, and emotion had no place here. When the sheet slid away, he found himself holding his breath. Her face was relaxed, almost serene. There was none of the tension he often saw, none of the subtle distortions that came with sudden endings. Her lips were slightly parted, her eyelashes resting naturally against her skin. A small bruise shadowed one temple, but it looked old, insignificant, not enough to explain anything. She looks like she's sleeping, he thought, and immediately dismissed the idea as a cliché. People always said that. It was rarely true, but the impression lingered anyway, stubborn and uncomfortable. He forced himself to continue, naming each step silently in his head the way he always did. Identification markers, external observation, documentation. His hands moved with practiced ease, placing instruments where they belonged, aligning tools that he had used so often they felt like extensions of his own body. Still, something felt wrong. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a misalignment, a sense that the rhythm he relied on had shifted slightly, enough to throw him off balance. He blamed the hour, the fatigue that crept into even the most disciplined routines. He began. Almost immediately, the unease sharpened into something colder. His movements slowed. He paused, eyes narrowing as he checked what he was seeing against what he expected to see. The match was imperfect. He stopped completely. His heart gave a hard, sudden beat. He leaned closer, careful now, attentive in a way that went beyond routine. His training surfaced instinctively, fragments of lectures and case studies he hadn't thought about in years. Rare errors, borderline states, situations where certainty arrived too early and left too little room for doubt. "That's not possible," he whispered, though the room offered no response. He straightened and took a step back, as if distance might clarify things. The clipboard lay where he had left it. He picked it up again, scanning the words with fresh intensity. The time of death, the name of the physician who had signed it, the quiet authority of ink on paper. He set the clipboard down slowly. If this was a mistake, it wasn't just his. But that didn't lessen the weight pressing into his chest. Responsibility was not a thing that could be easily divided. He moved with purpose now, pushing aside the fog of routine and letting urgency take its place. He reached for monitoring equipment that rarely saw use in this room, his hands trembling despite his effort to steady them. He told himself to breathe, to observe, to verify before drawing conclusions. The first reading was inconclusive. He swallowed, pulse thudding loudly in his ears. He adjusted, recalibrated, tried again. There it was, so faint it could have been dismissed by someone who wasn't looking for it. So slight that it hovered on the edge of perception, daring him to deny it. But it was there, and once seen, it could not be unseen. "Oh no," he said softly. Time seemed to stretch, each second pulling thin as wire. His mind raced ahead, mapping out consequences, procedures, the narrow window that might still exist. He had crossed a line unknowingly, stepping into territory that demanded a different set of rules entirely. "Stay with me," he said again, the words escaping before he could stop them. He had never spoken to a body like that before. It felt foolish and desperately human. He moved quickly, undoing what he could, reversing steps, his motions sharp and precise. He called out into the corridor, his voice echoing back, unanswered at first. Panic threatened at the edges of his control, but he forced it down, focusing on action. He grabbed the phone and called for help, his voice clipped and urgent. He didn't soften his words. There was no time for diplomacy. He needed people, equipment, authority, and he needed them now. When he hung up, the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. He watched the monitors, afraid that if he looked away the fragile sign he had seen would vanish. Doubt gnawed at him. What if he was wrong? What if this was nothing more than noise, a trick of exhausted senses? But hope, reckless and insistent, refused to let go. Footsteps finally sounded in the hallway, growing louder. The door swung open, and suddenly the room was filled with movement. Voices overlapped, questions fired, answers delivered in rapid succession. He stepped aside instinctively, explaining as best he could, watching faces shift from skepticism to focus. They worked with practiced efficiency, each person slipping into their role. The room transformed, no longer a place of conclusions but of possibility. He stood near the wall, hands clenched at his sides, feeling both utterly responsible and strangely powerless. As they worked, a peculiar detachment settled over him. He saw himself from the outside, a man who had trusted systems because systems were easier to rely on than doubt. A man who had nearly allowed finality to claim something that was not yet finished. Time lost meaning. He caught fragments of conversation, technical terms, probabilities, cautions, but they blurred together. All he could focus on was the fragile line they were trying to hold, the uncertain space between too late and just in time. Eventually, there was a pause. The kind that carried weight. One of the clinicians turned toward him. Her expression was careful, controlled. "There's activity," she said. "Weak, but present. We don't know what the outcome will be." He nodded, throat tight. Words failed him. Relief and dread tangled together, impossible to separate. A chance, however small, was still a chance. They prepared to move her, and he watched as the table he had known only as a place of endings became something else entirely. As they wheeled her out, the room seemed to exhale, the tension draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. When the door closed, the hum of the lights reclaimed the space. Everything looked exactly as it had before, and yet nothing felt the same. He sank onto a stool, elbows resting on his knees, and stared at the floor. His hands shook now that he no longer needed to keep them steady. Images replayed relentlessly. The moment of hesitation, the choice to stop, the thin margin that separated habit from catastrophe. How many times had he moved forward without questioning? How often had certainty gone unchallenged simply because it was convenient? He eventually stood and began to clean up, each movement slow, deliberate. There would be reports to write, explanations to give, procedures to review. There might be consequences he could not yet imagine. But beneath all of that, something deeper had shifted. Death, he realized, was not a single instant. It was a process, a fading boundary with edges that blurred under scrutiny. Standing at that boundary required more than knowledge and training. It required humility, and the courage to doubt even the most official of answers. When he finally turned off the lights and left the room, his footsteps echoed softly down the corridor. Somewhere beyond the sterile walls, the night continued, unaware of how close it had come to swallowing a life whole, or how close one man had come to letting certainty win over caution. The fluorescent lights hummed with their familiar, indifferent persistence, washing the room in a colorless glow that erased shadows and softened edges. Everything here was designed to be clean, controlled, final. Stainless steel reflected back distorted fragments of the space, and the faint scent of antiseptic clung to the air no matter how often it was scrubbed away. The morgue existed outside the rhythms of the rest of the hospital, a place where urgency had already ended and answers were meant to begin. He liked it that way. Night shifts were his preference. They carried a kind of quiet honesty. During the day, the corridors filled with footsteps, voices, questions, expectations. At night, there was only procedure. Only the work. The dead did not ask him to explain himself, and he did not have to soften his language or his conclusions. What he recorded here would eventually matter to someone, but in the moment, it belonged only to him and the truth he was trained to find. He glanced at the clock. A few minutes past midnight. Time felt different down here, stretched thin and oddly circular. He picked up the clipboard again, scanning the file for the third time even though he already knew every line. Female. Approximate age. 25 to 30. Found unresponsive in a public area. Emergency responders attempted resuscitation. Pronounced deceased at the scene. No identification recovered. Cause of death. Undetermined. Undetermined always left a faint itch at the back of his mind. It was necessary sometimes, an honest placeholder for missing information, but it also carried a quiet discomfort. It meant someone, somewhere, had reached the end of what they could know and stopped. Still, that decision hadn't been his to make. His role began after. He set the clipboard down and approached the table. The body lay beneath a white sheet, edges folded with careful precision. The sheet itself was almost symbolic, a thin barrier between a person and a case. He paused, fingers resting lightly on the fabric, aware of a subtle hesitation in his own body. That, too, annoyed him. He had learned long ago not to personalize these moments. The dead deserved professionalism, not projection. Respect was found in accuracy, not sentiment. He reminded himself of that as he pulled the sheet back. The first thing that struck him was how unremarkable she looked. Not in a dismissive way, but in the sense that nothing about her immediately declared tragedy. Her features were relaxed, her expression neutral. There was no obvious sign of struggle, no frozen tension. If he hadn't known where he was, he might have assumed she was resting. The thought made him frown. He leaned closer, checking details out of habit. Skin tone, temperature, small marks that might mean something later. There was a faint discoloration near her temple, easily overlooked, the kind of thing that could have come from any number of mundane incidents. It told no clear story. He straightened and exhaled slowly. Appearances were deceptive. They always were. He had seen too many cases where the truth hid well beneath a calm surface. He began to prepare, laying out instruments, aligning them with deliberate care. The motions were so familiar they barely registered as conscious decisions. His hands knew where to go. His mind slipped into the steady, methodical focus he relied on. And yet, the feeling returned, sharper this time. A sense of misalignment, as if the room itself were subtly off balance. He paused, listening to the hum of the lights, the distant whisper of machinery. Nothing had changed. Nothing should have changed. He told himself to proceed. The moment came quietly. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden movement. Just a realization that settled into him with unsettling clarity. What he was observing did not fit the expected pattern. Not enough to scream error, but enough to whisper it insistently. He stopped. His heart beat harder, faster, a physical response that surprised him with its intensity. He leaned in again, checking, rechecking. Training surfaced unbidden, dredging up old lectures and rare case studies. Candida.